also want to continue on with what is, frankly, our top story today, which is the rapidly evolving narrative around Vice President Kamala Harris, now seen as the presumptive Democratic nominee, after locking up the necessary amount of delegates to actually win the nomination at the convention just 4 weeks from now. But we want to look even further ahead, as Harris looks like she will be leading the Democratic ticket and up against Donald Trump in November, as to what markets should be watching for policy-wise if she actually could be president of the United States, or at least what they should be expecting to hear from her in terms of rhetoric on the campaign trail over the next several months. For that, we turn now to Nathan Dean. He is Bloomberg Intelligence Senior U.S. Policy Analyst based here in Washington, joining me in studio. So Nathan, you actually have a piece out on the Journal about this that looks into a variety of different sectors. I guess if we just take it from the highest level, if there is an area in which there is just status quo, Biden to Harris, not much changes on a Venn diagram, and then in the other part, things that could change dramatically under a potential Harris administration and areas in which maybe there's some degree of overlap. Is it largely more status quo than it is brace for disruption?
Yes, we think it's mostly status quo for a lot of industries, from banks to EVs to big tech and so forth like that. And we actually had an internal discussion about this, and one of our consensus is that when President Biden became president, his policies more gravitated to where Vice President Kamala Harris was, as opposed to Vice President Harris's policies gravitating where President Biden's stance is. But I will say, if you're looking at banks, one of the things that we've been looking at, look for a little bit more focus on consumer protection, look for a little bit more focus on lower to middle income protections and so forth like that. But really comes down to tariffs, trade, and then a lot of regulatory actions after that.
Well, it strikes me on that note that we shouldn't maybe just be thinking about, okay, how would Harris differ from Biden, but how much realistically would Harris differ from a Trump-Vance administration, especially on things like tariffs? We know that both Donald Trump and J.D. Vance are fans of protectionism, if you will. We also have heard from J.D. Vance pretty kind words for competition regulators in the U.S., praise for Lina Khan at the FTC. He seems to be supportive in general of antitrust efforts. So are there actually more ways in which the Republican and Democratic ticket may align on policy than you might think at face value?
Yeah, so let's talk about the technology aspect first with the antitrust. Senator Vance obviously gave praise to Lina Khan here at a Bloomberg event here in the office a couple of months ago. And, we don't think that's going to change all that much. This idea of economic populism is going to remain at the FTC, DOJ, probably no matter who wins the election. So if you're in the technology sector, that's certainly that you're going to have to live with now, and you're probably going to have to live with in the future. When it comes to tariffs, don't forget that when Senator Harris was around, she voted against the Canadian-U.S.-Mexico agreement. She voted against the TPP. Now, a lot of that was because of climate change concerns. And so we think that if Vice President Harris were to win, look for the Inflation Reduction Act to be boosted. But when it comes to tariffs, I think you're going to continue with this Biden strategy of targeted tariffs on specific industries to protect American workers versus this idea of 60% general tariffs on all imports coming from China. So I think, the Chinese rhetoric is going to be, tough no matter who wins. But I think that on the tariff strategy, more targeted in the Harris presidency, more broadly in a Trump presidency.
Well, and as we consider what Harris or Trump presidency can bring or might be able to bring, we also have to consider that it's very much going to depend on the balance of Congress and whether or not you have perhaps cemented control across both chambers or a split government, which makes it hard to get things done. What presidents do have power to do, though, is decide who they want at the helm of regulators. And I wonder to what extent you would expect that Kamala Harris would mean consistency in terms of who is actually at the top of these regulatory agencies, or if she might want to bring her own people in to pursue a little bit of a different kind of policy.
I think it's going to be a mix of both. I'm thinking of the SEC chairman, Gary Gensler.
Right.
I'm guessing,
so am I.
I think Chairman Gensler will probably stick around another year to 18 months if Kamala Harris wins. I think there's a lot of regulatory agency leaders who are like, look, I've been here for 4 years. Let's talk about a transition. So don't be surprised if you see, changing the guards. But I'm thinking of Lina Khan at the FTC, Rohit Chopra, the director of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. Now that if they get a second term, they're going to run out of the gates, and they're going to say, look, let's run with this and see if we can actually get a little bit more of that consumer protectionism in place. Because remember, when Kamala Harris was Attorney General of the state of California, she participated in a $25 billion settlement against the big banks on foreclosure. So, but I would always caution, when you talk regulations, you have to remember the courts. because as the Supreme Court has shown over the last month, it's going to be a lot more difficult to do rulemakings in the future. So always just keep that in mind.
Very good point. As we consider checks and balances here with Congress, there's also the check that can be provided from the courts, as that is the third branch of government, the judicial branch. Very, very quickly, though, when we think about 2025, what's ahead? Tax debate is obviously going to be front and center. Considering a lot of the Trump tax cuts that need to be renewed do focus more on small businesses, on consumers, not necessarily the business tax cuts. Would Kamala Harris actually, as you talk about being more pro-consumer protection and the little guy, be supportive of renewing that, do we think?
I think so. I mean, just remember, reconciliation comes into play. This is if the House, the Senate, and the presidency goes to one party. If that happens, you're going to see a broad tax debate. But I think ultimately you are going to see, a low middle income, that individual tax cut that expires at the end of 2025. I think that's going to stay no matter who wins the presidency. It's going to be a little bit more tweaks on things like the SALT deduction, maybe a little bit of corporate tax issues that expired. But ultimately, I think the individual tax rates are going to remain very similar.
All right, Nathan Dean of Bloomberg Intelligence. We're going to be talking to you a lot, as we always do, as we